Marcos wiped the grease off his hands with an old rag, letting out a tired sigh. The day had stretched longer than expected, and the only thing on his mind was a warm shower and a good night's sleep. His small auto repair shop, nestled on the outskirts of town, was already dimly lit, the neon sign flickering weakly as he locked up. Just as he turned to leave, a car's headlights sliced through the darkness, blinding him for a moment. The sound of sputtering and a struggling engine followed, and within seconds, a sleek black luxury car rolled up to the front of his shop, barely making it before dying completely. Marcos hesitated. It was late. He could just ignore it, pretend he hadn't seen anything. But the driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out. Even in the poor lighting, he could see the tension in her posture. She was clearly frustrated, maybe even anxious. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying an edge of urgency. "Is there any chance you can take a look at my car?" Marcos glanced at the vehicle, then at the woman. She wore a casual hoodie and jeans, her hair tied in a loose bun. She didn't look like the usual customers he got around here. Most people in luxury cars never ended up in this part of town. He sighed and scratched the back of his head. "You're lucky I haven't left yet. Let's see what's going on." The woman let out a breath of relief. "Thank you." "Seriously." Marcos opened the hood and examined the engine, his fingers moving with practiced ease. The issue was obvious, a blown fuse and a battery connection that looked loose. He could get it running, but the car needed more attention than a quick fix. "You're gonna need a bit of work here," he said. "I can get it running for now, but you might want to take it to a specialist for a full checkup." The woman crossed her arms, exhaling sharply. "Just my luck," she muttered. Marcos glanced at her. "Long day." "You have no idea," she said, shaking her head. "I was supposed to be somewhere hours ago, but I got lost, and now this." Marcos chuckled lightly as he reached for his toolbox. "Well, could be worse. At least you broke down in front of a mechanic." She smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess that's lucky." Marcos worked in silence for a few minutes, focused on the engine. The woman paced nearby, checking her phone occasionally, but her expression remained tense. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked casually, trying to keep the conversation light. "No. Just passing through. Traveling alone." She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yeah." Marcos nodded, tightening the last bolt. "All right, try starting it now." She slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but the dashboard flickered oddly. "It's running," she said, "but that didn't sound good." Marcos frowned. "Yeah. That battery's still a problem. You might make it a few miles, but it's risky." The woman exhaled, gripping the wheel. "So what do you suggest?" He wiped his hands on his rag again. "I can fix it properly, but it'll take a couple of hours. If you're not in a rush, I'd say leave it here for the night and pick it up in the morning." She looked at him, considering. For a moment, she seemed unsure, like she was debating something in her head. Then she sighed. "I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Marcos shrugged. "Not unless you want to risk getting stranded on the highway." She let out a small laugh, finally easing a bit. "All right. I'll figure something out." He nodded. "There's a motel down the road. Not fancy, but clean." She bit her lip, then extended a hand. "I'm Mia, by the way." Marcos shook it. "Marcos." For some reason, she gave him a long look before letting go. "Thanks for this," she said, stepping back. "I mean it." "No problem," he replied. As she gathered her things from the car, Marcos had no idea that this simple act of kindness would change his life forever. Marcos watched as Mia slung a small bag over her shoulder, hesitating before stepping away from the car. The dim glow from the workshop's light cast long shadows across the pavement, and for a moment she just stood there, as if lost in thought. "You sure the motel down the road is decent?" she asked, breaking the silence. Marcos smirked, wiping his hands on his rag again. "It's not the Ritz, but it's clean. The owner's a decent guy." She nodded but didn't move right away. Something about her demeanor struck him as unusual, like she was bracing herself for something. "You good?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Mia snapped out of her thoughts. "Yeah. Just a long day." He didn't push. People came through here with all sorts of problems. Car troubles were usually the least of them. "Want me to call you a ride?" he offered. She let out a soft chuckle. "You mean like a cab? Do those even exist out here?" Marcos grinned. "All right, fair point. Town's not exactly big. But I can give you a lift if you want." Mia studied him, her eyes searching his face, and after a moment she nodded. "That would actually be great. Thanks." Marcos locked up the shop and led her to his truck. It was old but reliable, with the kind of wear and tear that showed years of honest work. He opened the passenger door for her before getting in himself. As they pulled out onto the quiet road, an odd sense of ease settled in the air. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind that felt natural, like neither of them felt the need to fill it with unnecessary words. "So, Marcos," Mia finally said, glancing at him, "you always help stranded strangers, or am I just lucky?" Marcos shrugged. "Guess it depends on the stranger." She smirked. "And I passed the test." "You didn't look like a serial killer," he said with a straight face. Mia laughed, a real, unguarded laugh. It was brief, but genuine, and for a second she seemed lighter. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said. They drove a few more minutes before she spoke again. "So, you really don't know who I am?" Marcos glanced at her, puzzled. "Should I?" Mia looked at him carefully, almost studying his reaction. "No," she finally said, shaking her head. "I guess not." Marcos frowned slightly but didn't push. Whatever she was expecting from him, he clearly wasn't giving it. "I'm just not much of a social media guy," he admitted. "And I don't watch a lot of TV. Pretty much work, eat, and sleep." Mia smirked. "Sounds peaceful." "Sometimes," he admitted. "Other times, just boring." She looked out the window. "Boring sounds nice." Marcos didn't comment, but he could tell there was weight behind those words. A few minutes later, they pulled into the motel's small parking lot. The neon sign flickered, buzzing softly in the quiet night. "Well," Marcos said, putting the truck in park. "Here we are." Mia looked at the motel, then back at him. "Thanks again, Marcos." "Seriously." "No problem. Your car will be good to go in the morning." She hesitated. "Mind if I stop by early?" He nodded. "Yeah, sure. Anytime after 8. Mia opened the door, but before stepping out, she turned to him one last time. "You're a good guy," she said. Marcos chuckled. "I just fix cars." She gave him a small smile before closing the door and heading inside. As Marcos drove back to his shop, he found himself thinking about her words. There was something about her, something different. He just didn't know what. Not yet. The next morning, Marcos arrived at the shop earlier than usual. The air was crisp, and the sky still carried the last traces of dawn. He wasn't sure why, but something about last night's encounter lingered in his mind. By 7:45, he was already under the hood of Mia's car, checking everything over. The battery was still a problem, but nothing he couldn't fix. At exactly 8 a.m., the bell above the shop door jingled. Mia stepped in, wearing the same hoodie from the night before, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked like someone who hadn't slept much. "Morning," she said, her voice softer than last night. "Morning," Marcos replied, wiping his hands on his rag. "You're early." Mia smirked slightly. "Figured I'd see if my car is still in one piece." He chuckled. "It's getting there." She walked over, leaning against a nearby workbench as Marcos continued working. "So, this is your place?" she asked, looking around the shop. "Yeah. Been running it for a few years now." "You like it?" Marcos shrugged. "Pays the bills. Keeps my hands busy. Can't complain." Mia studied him for a moment, then said, "You don't seem like the kind of guy who complains about much." Marcos smirked. "What's the point? Life is what it is." She nodded slowly, looking down. "Must be nice to think like that." There it was again, that weight in her words. Marcos didn't know her, but something about her seemed tired, like she carried the kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. He tightened the last bolt and stepped back. "All right. You should be good to go. Mia glanced at the car, then back at him. That's it. Marcos nodded. That's it. She reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. How much do I owe you? He wiped his hands again. Call it 100. Mia raised an eyebrow. 100? You worked on this all morning? Yeah, and I just changed a battery and fixed some wiring. Nothing crazy. She hesitated, then pulled out a few bills and handed them to him. You sure you're not underselling yourself? Marcos smirked. Maybe. But not everything has to cost a fortune. Mia watched him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Then, she tucked her wallet away and leaned against the workbench again. You ever meet someone, she said slowly, who treats you like just a person? Not like an expectation, or a label, or a problem to be solved. Marcos frowned slightly but shook his head. Can't say I have. Mia exhaled, crossing her arms. Must be nice. He studied her, sensing there was something more behind those words, but before he could ask, she straightened. Well, she said, forcing a smile, guess I should get going. Marcos nodded. Drive safe. She hesitated again, as if debating something, but then she nodded and walked to her car. The engine roared to life smoothly this time, and she sat there for a moment before finally pulling out of the lot. Marcos watched until the car disappeared down the road, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Something told him this wasn't the last time he'd see her. Mia gripped the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, but her mind was somewhere else. The sound of the engine humming beneath her should have been a relief. Her car was fixed, she was back on track. But something about that small garage, that simple mechanic, lingered in her thoughts. She had expected the usual routine. Recognition. Judgment. Maybe even a comment disguised as a compliment. But Marcos had looked at her like she was just a person. That was rare. Unbelievably rare. Pulling into a gas station a few miles down the road, she parked and leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The morning sun was beginning to rise higher, casting warm light through the windshield. She should have been focused on where she was going next, but instead, all she could think about was that tiny moment when Marcos had asked, "What's the point?" Life is what it is. Mia let out a dry laugh. If only it were that simple. She checked her phone out of habit. A few missed calls, unread messages, emails that could wait. She had spent years with the world constantly watching, but in that garage, she had been invisible. And she had liked it. After refueling, she got back on the road, but the thought of Marcos stayed with her. The way he wiped his hands on that old rag. The way he shrugged off her questions. The way he had not known who she was. Or, if he did, how little he had cared. Mia hadn't realized how much she had missed that feeling. She drove without any real direction, just letting the miles pass. An hour later, she pulled over at a quiet rest stop and sat on a wooden bench, staring out at the empty road stretching ahead. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Maybe for the feeling to pass. Maybe for an answer to a question she hadn't even asked herself yet. Or maybe, just maybe, she wasn't done with that small town just yet. Marcos had just finished lunch when the familiar hum of a luxury car pulled up outside his shop. He glanced at the clock, barely past noon. He wasn't expecting any customers this early, especially not one he thought had already left town. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on his rag as Mia stepped out of her car. This time, she wasn't in a hurry. She moved slower, more deliberate, as if she had thought long and hard before coming back. "Didn't expect to see you again," Marcos said casually, leaning against the shop door. Mia gave a small smile. "Yeah, I didn't either." She hesitated for a moment, then closed the car door, walking toward him. "I had some time to think," she admitted, crossing her arms. "And I realized something." Marcos raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I don't think I've met someone like you in a long time." Marcos let out a short chuckle. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Mia smirked. "Good, I think." A breeze passed between them, carrying the scent of oil and asphalt. Marcos could tell there was something more to this, something she wasn't saying yet. "Look," she said, exhaling. "There's something you should probably know about me." Marcos tilted his head slightly, curious but unfazed. "Okay." She hesitated again. He could see the way she was weighing her words, as if bracing for some kind of reaction. "My full name is Mia Khalifa," she finally said. Silence. Marcos blinked, waiting for more. When she didn't continue, he shrugged. "All right." Mia narrowed her eyes slightly. "That's it." "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "Nice to meet you, again." She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Marcos thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Should I?" Mia studied his face. No flicker of recognition. No sudden shift in how he looked at her. Just the same calm, easy expression he'd worn since last night. For the first time in years, she was standing in front of someone who genuinely didn't see her through the lens of her past. And it was unbelievably freeing. "I guess not," she muttered, almost to herself. Marcos smirked. "I mean, if you're a celebrity or something, no offense, but I don't really keep up with that stuff." Mia exhaled, rubbing her temple. "Wow. That's refreshing." Marcos leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "Why? You expecting me to freak out?" "Kind of," she admitted. "Most people do." "Well," he said, pushing off the bench. "Guess I'm not most people." Mia smiled at that, a real smile. She had spent so much time running from labels, from people who only saw her as a headline or a controversy. But here, in a run-down little auto shop, she was just another person with a broken-down car. And for the first time in a long time, that felt enough. Mia sat on the edge of the workbench, absent-mindedly tapping her fingers against the wood. Marcos, unfazed by her revelation, leaned against the opposite counter, arms crossed, waiting for her to say whatever was clearly weighing on her mind. She had expected shock, awkwardness, maybe even judgment. But instead, Marcos had treated it like she'd just told him her name was Sarah or Emily. Like it didn't change a damn thing. And that was exactly what made her stay. "I don't think you realize how rare you are," she finally said, exhaling. Marcos smirked. "I fix cars, Mia. That's about it." She shook her head. "No. You see people for what they are, not what the world says they are." He shrugged. "Aren't those the same thing?" Mia let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "I wish." She looked at him then, really looked. He was different, and that difference was like a breath of fresh air. She had spent years being judged, adored, hated, and dissected by people who didn't even know her. But Marcos, he just saw her, not as a persona, not as a past, but as a person. And that was worth more than he probably even realized. Mia pulled out her wallet again. "What are you doing?" Marcos asked, raising an eyebrow. She thumbed through a few $100 bills and held them out to him. "For the work you did on my car." Marcos frowned. "I already told you, 100 was enough." Mia smirked. "I know. But this isn't for the car." He didn't take the money, so she set it on the counter instead. "This is for you," she continued. "Because people like you don't get enough credit in this world." Marcos looked at the stack of cash, then at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Marcos wasn't the type to take handouts, that much was clear. But Mia wasn't the type to let something meaningful go unnoticed. Finally, he exhaled, picking up the money. He counted it, $5,000. He let out a low whistle. "You do realize that's, like, 50 times what I charged you, right?" Mia shrugged. "So?" Marcos chuckled. "So, I'm not going to take $5,000 for changing a battery." Mia tilted her head. "Then don't think of it that way. Think of it as a thank you, for reminding me that I'm still a person." Something about the way she said it made Marcos pause. He studied her face, the way her expression softened just slightly, like she wasn't just talking about today but about years of being seen the wrong way. He sighed, shaking his head. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Mia grinned. "You have no idea." Marcos hesitated for only a moment longer before tucking the money into his back pocket. Not because he wanted it, but because refusing would mean rejecting what it meant to her. "All right," he said. "But if I ever see your car again, I'm charging you double." Mia laughed. A real, unguarded laugh. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. A week passed. Marcos hadn't thought much about Mia after she left. Not because she wasn't memorable, she was. But life went on, and he had cars to fix, bills to pay, and an old truck that still needed a new alternator. The money she had left him sat in an envelope inside his toolbox, untouched. He wasn't sure why he hadn't spent it yet. Maybe because it felt like more than just money. It felt like something else, something unfinished. Then, on a quiet afternoon, just as he was closing up, that same black luxury car pulled into his lot. Marcos looked up from his paperwork, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, I'll be damned." Mia stepped out, this time without hesitation. She wasn't just passing through. She had come back on purpose. Marcos leaned against the doorway, smirking. "Battery died again, or did you miss me?" Mia chuckled, shaking her head. "Funny. No, the car's fine." "Then what are you doing here?" She hesitated, something flickering in her expression. "I guess I just wanted to see if you were real." Marcos raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure I am." Mia crossed her arms, exhaling. "You ever meet someone and feel like, I don't know, like they remind you that not everything in the world is fake?" Marcos shrugged. "Can't say I have." Mia smirked. "Well, I have. And you're kind of annoying for being one of them." He chuckled. "You came all the way back here to tell me that?" Mia shook her head. "No. I came back because I didn't want to leave things the way they were." Now she had his attention. Marcos watched as she walked over to the workbench, running her fingers along the surface like she was grounding herself. "I spent so much of my life being seen the wrong way," she admitted. "Everywhere I go, people already think they know me before I even open my mouth. And for a long time, I just let them. It was easier that way." Marcos stayed quiet, letting her speak. "But then I met you," she continued, "and you didn't see any of that. You just saw me as some girl with a broken-down car." Marcos shrugged. "Seemed like the truth." Mia smiled softly. "Yeah. And you have no idea how rare that is." Silence settled between them, comfortable and unforced. Marcos exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "So, what now?" Mia met his gaze. "I don't know. But I don't think I'm done being here yet." Marcos smirked. "Well, I hope you like small towns." Mia grinned. "Turns out I might." And just like that, she stayed. Mia didn't leave that night. Or the next. At first, she told herself she was just passing time, taking a break from the world she had built around herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't just escaping something. She was looking for something. And somehow, in the quiet hum of Marcos's garage, in the scent of oil and metal, in the way he just saw her, she felt closer to finding it. She started showing up at the shop every afternoon. Sometimes with coffee. Sometimes just to sit on the old workbench while Marcos worked. She never said much about her life before, and he never asked. It was an unspoken understanding. He would let her just be. And that was why she kept coming back. One evening, as Marcos tightened the last bolt on an engine, Mia watched him from her usual spot. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. Marcos glanced at her, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Leaving where?" "This town. This shop. Doing something else." He smirked. "Like what?" "Becoming a Wall Street guy." Mia rolled her eyes. "No, idiot. I mean, something different." Marcos leaned against the car, thinking. "Nah. I like fixing things. Always have. People break stuff, I make it work again. Simple." Mia studied him for a moment. "Must be nice to know exactly who you are." Marcos tilted his head. "You don't." She exhaled, gripping the edge of the workbench. "I don't think I ever did." For a long time, silence stretched between them. And then, finally, Marcos spoke. "Well," he said, "guess you're in the right place to figure it out." Mia looked at him, a slow smile creeping onto her lips. Maybe he was right. Days turned into weeks. Mia still hadn't left. She didn't know what she was doing, or where it was leading, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about that. She was just existing. One afternoon, she walked into the shop to find Marcos sitting at his desk, staring at the untouched envelope of cash she had given him weeks ago. "You still haven't used that?" she asked, crossing her arms. Marcos sighed, shaking his head. "Didn't feel right." Mia raised an eyebrow. "You realize most people wouldn't hesitate to take free money, right?" Marcos smirked. "Guess I'm not most people." She chuckled, shaking her head. Then, after a moment, she grabbed the envelope off the desk. "What are you doing?" Marcos asked. Mia opened it, took out a single bill, and slapped it onto the counter. "Fine. There. Now you're not taking all of it." Marcos blinked, looking between her and the $100 bill. "That's your idea of compromise?" Mia grinned. "It's better than nothing." He laughed. "You're ridiculous. And yet, here I am." Marcos shook his head, watching as she tucked the rest of the money into his jacket pocket instead. "You're impossible, you know that?" Mia smirked. "So I've been told." That night, they sat outside the shop, watching the last traces of sunset fade into the horizon. The air was cool, the world quiet. Mia pulled her hoodie tighter around herself. "You ever think about what one small moment can do?" Marcos glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She exhaled, looking up at the sky. "Like, if my car hadn't broken down that night, if I hadn't stopped here, my life would still be the same. I'd still be running from everything. But now, I don't know." Marcos was quiet for a moment before he finally said, "Yeah. Sometimes the smallest things change everything." Mia turned to him. "You think this is one of those times?" Marcos held her gaze, then nodded. "Yeah, I do." Mia smiled. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of where life was taking her next. Because for once, she was exactly where she wanted to be.